Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a Net Zero Watch webinar on the topic of the energy crisis, causes and solutions. And I'm sure you won't need me to tell you that we're seeing an incredibly tumultuous environment in the energy space right now. Prices are skyrocketing, and that's really been a key impetus to the massive inflation that we're seeing right across the world right now. We've seen an awful war in Ukraine that has furthered what was already an emergent crisis and amplified it even further. But there are also long-term policy choices that have been contributing to high energy prices in the West as well. So there's a whole range of factors that are at play here. And I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with a really esteemed panel. I'm absolutely delighted to have our three panelists here this evening. Firstly, my colleague, John Constable, who's Energy Director here at Net Zero Watch. I'm sure you'll be very familiar with him. He's published a number of reports with us. There's a key part of the team as we look at these issues day in, day out. And we've got Kathryn Porter, who has an enormous range of experience in the actual energy market itself and in the financial markets as they deal with energy. So we're looking forward to getting her sort of commercial expertise here in terms of how some of these policies and some of these market interactions are playing out in the marketplace. And of course, we've got Andy Meyer as well from the think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, just up the road from us here in 55 Tufton Street in London. The IEA do a fabulous job at promoting sensible free market approaches across the political spectrum and across the different issues. And Andy has been a particularly articulate commentator on energy issues in the media, particularly on GB News recently, Talk TV, and has been speaking a lot of sense on Twitter as well with his interventions in this debate. So lots to look forward to. I won't hold up people any longer because I'm sure you will all want to hear from our panelists. So without further ado, I would like to go to Kathryn Porter. So please, I'll just unmute you, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to participate in this event today. We're experiencing what the press is calling a cost of living crisis, largely driven by rapid increases in energy costs. And there are three factors at play, two of which have received a lot of attention and one which hasn't. Last autumn, we saw global gas prices shoot up as a result of an asymmetric response to the pandemic. Supply was cut by more than demand and took longer to recover. Combined with a cold winter in Europe and then heat waves across much of the Northern Hemisphere last year, Europe went into last winter with very low gas inventories, and prices ramped up as we had to compete with Asian buyers in the LNG markets. The expectation was that this situation would stabilize sometime in 2022, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine derailed those expectations. With Western buyers now wanting to stop trading with Russia, new gas projects will need to come online to replace those volumes, and that's going to support prices for much longer. So while COVID and the war have both been very well publicized, the other pricing dynamic has received much less attention, and that's the effect of decarbonization. Many people mistakenly believe that renewable energy is cheap and reduces energy prices. Well, we've been subsidizing renewable generation in Britain now for over 20 years, and during that time, we've seen a steady increase in end user prices, a trend which is completely different to the behavior of wholesale prices during the same period. All of the evidence to date indicates that renewable generation increases end user prices, and when you break it down, you can see why. First of all, we have to pay subsidies to build this generation. Then, because it's intermittent, we have to subsidize conventional generation to be available to provide backup when it isn't windy or sunny. The new generation is built in places that don't have existing network infrastructure, which is particularly the case in offshore wind. And in Britain, the windiest places are also furthest away from demand centres. This means we have to pay for new network infrastructure and increasingly also have to pay curtailment fees to generators when network constraints force them to turn down. And finally, we have to pay much higher balancing costs to maintain a balance between supply and demand in real time, which is harder when higher proportions of generation are intermittent. Even before the increases in gas prices last autumn, these factors were driving significant increases in end user prices. By last summer, policy costs were 25% of end user bills, and network costs had grown to 23%. The government has liked to portray suppliers as profiteers who've earned excess returns on the back of consumers. And that was the premise of the price cap. But it's not true, and it wasn't true back in 2016 when the Competition and Markets Authority claimed suppliers were earning 1.4 billion per year in excess profits. As former regulator Stephen Littlechild has demonstrated, the CMA failed to follow its own guidelines when calculating this figure, and as a result, it got it wrong by a factor of 10. According to Littlechild, the actual customer detriment was only 170 million, and was probably because of Ofgem's previous restrictions on tariffs. In fact, the supply of electricity to the domestic market has been loss-making for years now, and in the past year, domestic gas markets have also become loss-making and forcing half of the suppliers out of the market. This lack of profitability also explains the lack of innovation in the sector. Many people had assumed that with the development of networked home technology, tech companies would enter the market, and supermarkets briefly did flirt with the idea as well. But the combination of low profitability and high regulatory burdens has scared many of these companies away and inhibited innovations that might see the development of new business models such as energy as a service that are widely seen as important in supporting consumers through the energy transition. The result is that the domestic energy segment has stagnated, while prices will remain high, driven by a combination of external shocks and poor policy decisions. Each winter, thousands of people die in Britain as a result of being unable to adequately heat their homes. With 40% of consumers expected to be in fuel poverty this coming winter, that figure is set to rise, particularly if the weather is colder than normal. The government has announced support measures that will cover about half of the expected price increases, but things are expected to become very difficult, and there are already signs of self-disconnection among the most vulnerable consumers. The other big area of concern in Britain is around security of supply. And while the press is focusing on gas, the real worry is in the electricity market, where we could see rationing for industrial users this winter. The reason is that the winter capacity margin has been falling steadily, and closing conventional capacity, which makes the highest contribution to margins, is not being replaced on a like-for-like basis. This year, we're expecting 2 gigawatts of nuclear capacity and 4 gigawatts of coal to close. The government had apparently hoped that EDF would keep one of its nuclear reactors open. It won't, and is negotiating with coal operators to keep their plants open this winter. There's news of some special arrangements being negotiated. And last week, the government reached agreement with EDF to keep 400 megawatts of capacity at West Burton A open as the station of last resort. However, the remaining 1,600 megawatts will no longer be available. The other huge challenge this winter relates to the situation across the Channel in France. Half of the French nuclear fleet is offline after systemic problems have been identified in the cooling systems of their reactors. The French nuclear regulator believes these problems will take years to fully resolve. This means that instead of exporting, France is now relying on imports, including from Britain. So come the winter, instead of benefiting from 3 gigawatts of imports from France, we could be exporting 3 gigawatts, a net impact of 6 gigawatts. Altogether, the available capacity for the winter could be 10 to 12 gigawatts lower than last year, or around 8 gigawatts on a derated basis. We may also be unable to rely on imports from elsewhere, since the situation in Norway is also a cause for concern. Last year, Norway opened 2 large interconnectors, one with us and one with Germany, but since then, power prices in Norway have risen by a factor of 10, with the government subsidising end users to up to 80% of their electricity costs. These exports have been draining Norwegian reservoirs. And contrary to common belief, Norway can't just replace that through pumping because very little of its hydro capacity has pumping capabilities. To make matters worse, Norway's having a very dry year and its hydro levels are approaching 20-year lows. The government has instituted an energy commission to investigate the issue, And it may be that when it reports back in December, it recommends reducing exports on its interconnectors to protect the domestic market. So we definitely shouldn't assume that Norway will continue to give access to its hydro resources to other countries. The final problem of the capacity margins was that the top-up capacity auction for this winter saw a shortfall for the first time ever, with the amount procured being 365 megawatts less than the target. Last winter, the derated capacity margin was 3.9 gigawatts. This could be completely wiped out by the changes I've mentioned. While renewable generation has been built this year, we can experience periods of up to 2 weeks with no wind, so this can be very concerning. National Grid has said it will issue another early indication of winter margins next month, but the signs aren't good. Even if the other 2 gigawatts of coal capacity can be kept open, winter margins could be very low or negative, depending on the assumptions for interconnector flows, making the grid very vulnerable to unplanned outages. And large industrial users are very concerned about the prospect of involuntary curtailment this winter. The best advice for them is to buy or hire diesel gensets in order to reduce the impact on their operations. The headlines are all about the cost of energy at the moment, but once we get into the winter, security of supply could very well emerge to be a bigger issue. It's also pretty clear that net zero ambitions are only important until they're not. Affordability and security of supply can very quickly take over, which is why we're now seeing the government scramble to keep the oldest, dirtiest coal power stations open. And while expensive energy is unpopular, unreliable, expensive energy is likely to be even more unpopular, and the government should take note of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. Lots to ponder there. If I could just ask you a couple of quick questions before we move on to our next panelist, and then we're going to come back for audience questions at the end. I just wanted to pick up on your point about interconnectors. It seems the government is relying quite significantly on interconnector flows in the future to be able to meet some of our electricity needs when margins are low. But we see also sort of wind conditions being very similar across large areas of Europe at certain times. So there's a strategic vulnerability there. I wonder if you could comment on that, and also on the risk to the single market for electricity. We've seen countries like France raise the prospect of knocking Britain out of this market for electricity as a threat in negotiations that are ongoing around Northern Ireland and various Brexit complications. Do you see that as a threat to our energy security as well?
Well, I'd say to your second point, it might actually turn out to be a good thing for us. I mean, certainly this year it would be good if we did export to France in the winter. So yeah, I mean, if the French want to cut the connection, that would be great. I'm also a bit confused that they're suggesting this, since Ireland is highly dependent on energy from the UK. And so I'm not entirely sure how they think that's going to continue working if they were to cut the UK off from the continent. On your other question about interconnector flows and the wider reliance on wind and so on, I mean, I agree. I think that's really difficult. You've got large numbers of countries now trying to follow broadly similar strategies of relying on wind in particular to replace fossil fuel generation. And those high pressure, low wind conditions can extend over very wide areas. We saw that in September last year, about 2 weeks, when it wasn't just not windy here, it wasn't windy across much of Northern Europe. And I think in the future, this is going to start to become quite sensitive, because at the moment, energy flows on the interconnectors just based on the price differentials between the markets. But all the countries have their own different strategies for their generation mixes. And we're seeing now with Norway, Norwegian citizens are carrying the cost of the fact that Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands haven't adequately invested in their own domestic generation capacity. And at some point, people are going to say, that's not really on. And if I were sitting in Norway right now, I'd be lobbying to stop exporting electricity, because it's definitely not in the best interest of Norwegians.
It sounds like we're going to have a lot of bad news, unfortunately, over the course of this webinar. Hopefully, towards the end, there may be some positive glimpses somewhere that we can find to try and look to how we might solve these problems as well. So I think we'll go on to the next panelist at this point. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for your insightful remarks. I'm sure we'll be returning to a lot of these topics in a short period of time. Just a note to our audience, you can submit questions through the Q&A panel, which you'll see along the bottom of your screen. And with this webinar, we've actually got a new function so you can vote for some of your favorite questions as well. So if you can't think of one of your own, please vote for which one you would like to be answered the most. And that's in the question and answer tab. So I notice there's a chat function as well. Please feel free to talk between yourselves, but we'll be looking at the question and answer panel when we choose the questions at the end. So please do feed into that, and we're looking forward to hearing what everyone's questions are. So thank you, Kathryn. I'll take us on to our next panelist now, which is going to be John. And so I've just asked him to unmute, and John, please take it away.
Thank you, Harry. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. As anyone listening to Kathryn's very detailed and, of course, absolutely accurate description will infer, a mess of this complexity and staggering depth is not a work of moments. Governments, not just our government, sadly, have been working on this quite deliberately for quite some time, not with the intention of creating the mess. They've envisioned other outcomes. But this is the result of decades of mistaken policy. It's not the case that something fundamentally sound was run over by the invasion of Ukraine. This was a fundamentally mistaken policy stretching back to the early 2000s, which was eventually derailed by an event, as it was bound to be, created an extremely fragile system, which has at last met its nemesis in the emergence of a European war. When did it start? Well, it's deep. It goes back into the late 1990s in Europe and to the early 2000s in Britain, when Tony Blair very mistakenly took the UK off the gas to nuclear track, which had been established partly through light touch policy instituted by the Conservative Party and partly through spontaneous market action. They'd chosen gas because it was a very superior and economic way of generating electricity, and nuclear was developing rather too slowly, but developing along a promising track. This was good for consumers, and it was good for the overall British economy. Blair took that dividend and decided to indulge in a spectacular gesture with regard to renewable energy, and which is, of course, as anyone can tell, a Veblen good. These are thermodynamically incompetent generators, which only a very rich society can afford. And we're now reaching the point actually where we can't afford these particular goods. The question really arises, how is it that politicians such as Blair and others, because after all, we're not alone in making this mistake globally, have arrived at this particular point? Why do they make this mistake? It's difficult to say exactly in particular cases, but I think we can say something general about the way that, as we think as human beings about energy, we just don't get energy. It's a very strange concept. I think most people think of it as a substance, and most of the economists I know do think of it as a substance. They treat it just as another input. It isn't. It's a very abstract concept. It's not even an input. It's not a substance. It's a character state of all inputs in the economy. And therefore, to misunderstand it is to really expose yourself to very, very serious errors, such as the ones we've made over the last 20 to 30 years. The difficulty is that human psychology seems to be energy blind, and we have lots of evolved structures which enable us to deal with the world. We have a lot of naive physics, which is pretty effective, but energy doesn't appear to be part of the mental furniture. And we have to refer to physics to get any kind of purchase on it at all. Very few of us take the trouble to learn even basic physics. And so many of our politicians, of course, are lawyers and therefore believe that the world is infinitely plastic and responds simply to legal restrictions. And you can pass a law and the world will be a different place, and they hope a better place too. Far from it. The world is extremely resistant to our wishes, and it's only through the use of very superior quality, high quality energy that we manage to make it a safe and tolerable place in which to raise our families. unfortunately, this point has been neglected over the last decades. And so we've driven renewables into the system using enormous amounts of subsidies. The UK is currently subsidizing renewables at around about £10 billion per year. And that's not including the very extensive system integration costs, to which Kathryn referred, the constraint payments and the cost of expanding the network and running the whole system suboptimally, particularly in relation to support plant, the backup to which you refer. But in Europe, the subsidies are of an even greater scale. I mean, since 2008, up to the present day, the European Union has spent something like 700 to 800 billion euros on subsidizing renewable. I mean, this is, even for a large economic area, that is a spectacular amount of malinvestment. And it continues. I mean, the astonishing thing is that the European Union seems not to have learnt its lesson. And as yet, Britain has not done so either, though I think probably we're going to wake up first. I think we are waking up. I mean, the fact that three of us are having this sort of discussion shows that people are beginning to talk and feel that they can talk openly about this. But the key insight is going to have to be that we must realize that it's the physics that counts, and that the renewable energy systems to which we've been forced to, or compelled to buy through policy are utterly inadequate and have rendered our systems deeply fragile. Now, this is the fragility of the current system is the real concern. And that, of course, bears on the remedies which we have or could apply to the current situation. Because the crisis is not acute, or has both chronic and acute dimensions, the remedies can only be, in the longer term, major reforms of policy. We're not going to be able to simply plaster over the cracks and hope to get on as we were before. We have to perform a root and branch reform of our energy policies in order to deal with the chronic problems which extend back into the early 2000s and a little bit beyond, and also as well as dealing with the acute difficulties arising from the Ukrainian invasion and the fallout from rejecting Russian supplies of gas. This is extremely complex, and I cannot see any way in which it can be done without imposing considerable additional costs on consumers. I mean, it's not simply a question of saying we've done something expensive in the past, we'll now try and do something cheap. There are no cheap options. We've damaged our energy system so badly over the past 20 years that fixing that is going to require considerable additional costs for consumers. And I've just written a paper on the European Union in which I conclude that explaining to European consumers that they must now face a very costly, distressed policy correction is going to be one of the most formidable political difficulties facing elected representatives throughout the EU, and unfortunately here in the UK still. We have more freedom of movement due to Brexit, and that's a very good thing. We can do things more promptly and more effectively in our own interests. But nevertheless, many of the problems we face are inherited from our commitment to EU policies, which continues to this day. So we need to unwind from those policies very rapidly insofar as we can. But I emphasize, and Harry, you said that we have a lot of bad news in this discussion, and I fear there is hardly any good news at all about it. Waking up to the problem would be a step in the right direction. Fixing it is going to be extremely painful for us all. There will be significant reductions in standard of living throughout Europe in order to address these difficulties. I cannot see any way of avoiding it. I'd be interested to know whether my colleagues agree with this rather pessimistic perspective. Kathryn perhaps would have a view on that.
Thank you very much, John. Kathryn, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're actually asking me right now, I mean,
why not? Yes.
I do agree. I think it's just looking in Britain, where are we getting to, and the reduction in capacity margins, we're reaching a point where our options for fixing that are becoming very limited, and narrowing down to one, which we're building more gas power stations as quickly as we possibly can, because you can build a CCGT in a year and a half, and that there's no other generation form that can say that. No. And literally we're running out of choices, and while gas prices remain high, that's also going to be an expensive choice. Longer term, I think we need to be much more proactive around nuclear power.
Yes,
I noticed we had a question come in, if I might just ask this directly because I think it's relevant here, which is how would more gas? I mean, people are looking at the price of gas at the moment. It's very high. I believe we had a question come in about this, and he's saying, well, how can more gas, like a new combined cycle gas turbine, how could that get us out of our problems, which are potentially linked to the price of gas being actually so high at the present moment?
We've got two problems. One is high prices and the other one's availability. So the availability issue is probably the more critical one. If supplies are interrupted, that's a much bigger problem for the economy and for individuals than any other aspect of the trilemma, either cost or decarbonisation. So you really need to make as many efforts as you can to avoid interruptions in supply. So if you can procure new capacity and gas is the likely candidate, then that's what you should do. On the question of gas availability, we're actually not likely to run out of gas in Britain. It's just a question of how much do we have to pay for it. And yes, it can be expensive, but there's not really any other option other than to reduce demand. And I don't think we can reduce it enough to make a difference.
No, I would second that. The key thing about gas is that there is quite a lot of it globally. At the moment, we have very little commitment to gas in the future. It's deprecated by policy remarks, and the fossil fuel industry has been demoralized repeatedly by policy interventions. Encouraging investment in gas, and particularly in domestic production of gas here in the UK. I'm open-minded about shale. I'd like to see them try it. I'm not certain it will succeed, but they certainly should be given the opportunity of trying. But it's some years off before that will actually matter to us. In the short term, recommitment to gas will, I think, enable traders to enter into longer term contracts, and that may have some mitigating effect on price exposure. But I fear the fact of the matter is that we really don't have any alternative. We're just going to have to take the prices as they come in order to secure supply, as Kathryn says. In the medium term, I think we have to start talking about coal again. I've said this several times over the last few years with increasing conviction. A few years ago, I was saying perhaps we should start thinking about it in case things don't go right. And now I think it's necessary. I don't see why we shouldn't say that actually building an ultra supercritical coal station or 2 or 3 or 4 in the UK is a perfectly sensible way of mitigating gas dependency so we have a more balanced fuel supply. You look at the UK fuel mix and the thing that jumps out at you immediately is that we have a fuel diversity problem. Essentially, this is a gas system which is distorted and degraded in terms of its effectiveness and efficiency by randomly intermittent renewables such as wind and solar. So we're extremely exposed to gas when we shouldn't be. So I think a major effort to try to is to nuclear by all means, but perhaps we should have a serious conversation about whether actually in order to mitigate risk, we need to build some coal stations too.
John, if I could just come to you for one question before we move on to our next speaker, which is to try and find a positive note here. You mentioned there were Brexit freedoms that perhaps we could use to improve the situation. Which one of those freedoms or which of those freedoms do you think are going to be the most significant in terms of moving forward in a positive way?
Well, we should certainly resile from all commitments to the former Renewables Directive, the EU Renewables Directive. We simply have to abandon the renewables targets. Whether the Europeans do so or not is not our affair now. I think they will do that. And we can start doing that immediately. We should probably wind down emissions trading. It's not been successful in the European Union. It might have worked if it had been the sole instrument of policy, but when combined with the renewables policy, it was doomed to fail. And the same as here, it's true here. We have a UK emissions trading scheme combined with renewables. It will fail in exactly the same way. So we need to unwind all those previous commitments to emissions trading and renewables targets. And of course, we also have freedom over taxation now. So we could start doing things with VAT, and not just on energy. I mean, bear in mind that the 20% VAT charge increases the cost of all goods and services, which are rising because of energy prices. So you've got a multiplier effect on top there. And desynchronizing from VAT regulations in Europe, which I know is something the civil service in Britain doesn't wish to do, because they wish to leave the UK prepared for re-entry into the European Union should that become necessary. But desynchronization on all these matters would give us liberty of action and reduce costs to consumers, and some of them in quite short order, but mostly in the medium term. Some pain is inevitable.
Well, thank you very much, John, for those remarks. And so now I will take things on to our final speaker, which is Andy Meyer from the IEA.
Well, thanks very much, Harry, and thank you, John. Thank you, Kathryn. Gosh, that was quite depressing, wasn't it? I mean, you've asked me to try and find a ray of sunshine in that sea of gloom, looking at the future of the energy system and the impact on prices. I'm not going to be desperately cheery, but I think we do need to step back a bit and say, where do we actually want to be in the very long term? And personally, I'm both a climate optimist and somebody who's optimistic about the ability of us to be able to generate the kind of energy transformation that will deliver a future which is not dependent on fossil fuels. Where we are today is we're about 80% dependent on fossil fuels for our primary energy across heating, transport, and power generation. And we need to be in a place in the distant future that is not that. We don't yet know what the energy mix will be. The government are making very confident predictions that it will be one based on nuclear, one based on wind, a bit of solar, one based on carbon capture and storage, and they're betting the farm on hydrogen. The problem with the government's position is that they believe that they can get to that happy, sunny uplands from where we are today with a completely consistent and coherent central plan that can be perfectly delivered by 2050, such that the government will achieve its net zero ambition to decarbonize at least this economy and potentially make a huge world-leading contribution for everybody else by that date. And this is just nonsense. I mean, one of the big issues that we've talked about, everybody talked about the Ukraine, talked about the impact of the pandemic, but we didn't talk about net zero naivety. I mean, Boris Johnson treated COP26 Glasgow as though it were a repeat of the 2012 Olympic Games. He saw himself bestriding the world stage, waving a massive Union Jack, saying, look at me, I can set the example, be the world leader that I've always wanted to be by tackling something really serious and fundamentally important, which was climate change. And the result of COP26, as you know, was a lot of tinkering, a lot of umming and ahhing, and a lot of agreements that frankly don't add up to much. Because frankly, this is not how you achieve technology change. It's not how you achieve change in the energy system. We know how that works in reality. We saw it in the dash for gas. We created a market-based system in the United Kingdom that prioritized the forms of energy that were actually those that could deliver the best bang for your buck, and also, by coincidence, had a stronger environmental impact. We displaced coal with gas. And we didn't do that by setting gas targets. We did it by allowing the market to work. And I agree with both Kathryn and John. One of the fundamental things that's happened since is that we've retreated from that with ever greater intervention. This is ratchet intervention. What we've done is allowed people to pile on new regulations, new policies on every single mistake that we have made. So we keep doubling down. I think the windfall tax is a classic example. It's not just a bad idea. We are in the middle of a crisis caused by a shortage of the supply of oil and gas. And our response to that is to put a tax on the very thing domestically that could actually help. It's mad. What we could have done instead was look at the problem more coherently and said, is this something that will actually help deliver a solution in the short term to this problem, and in the long term encourage investment? Well, what we know from the Treasury is that they didn't do any analysis whatsoever. It was simply a reaction to the bad headlines they were getting from the opposition. So they thought the best way of dealing with that was to put out something that would make them look even more committed to the environment than the opposition were doing. And this is just not serious. If we keep doing this, if the government doesn't change tack, then we're going to end up in the kind of place that both of you fear, which is that there will be a series of blackouts, or rather, I think energy intensive industries will be first in the queue to be shut down. Possibly then there's going to be problems for other parts of the economy. Usually it's been the case that we've not got to that point where we think a blackout is actually going to happen for the domestic economy, at which point the by-elections tonight are going to be the least of the government's problems. If you don't keep the lights on, if you let old people freeze in their homes, if you allow prices to remain high, you're going to lose an election. And I hope at least the government gets that, because their expertise does seem to be in winning elections, not in energy policy. So what can we do about it? Well, short term, not very much. The government is doing the right things there. It's going around the world pleading with OPEC members and the Americans to open up what they can open up and export that to us if they will. They're trying to do long-term contracts. they're trying to do deals. And these are particularly Saudi Arabia, countries with whom we've had a relationship that's not that dissimilar to the one that we've had with Russia, perhaps not quite as bad. But OPEC are sitting there thinking, well, we're going to see how long we can string this out before we inevitably do increase supply. And that could be 6 months, it could be a year, but we should have some hope that eventually the supply of oil and gas globally will go up. And there will be some kind of deals that will be done, which will help the European regional situation on gas, which is particularly acute. In the medium term, the thing that they could be doing now, which they are looking at, is the relaxation of planning regulations, the relaxation of permitting, and the incredibly complicated series of different hurdles that energy generators and developers have to go through in order to do anything. And that's not just a comment about fracking or what's going on in the North Sea at the moment. It's also true of wind farms, solar farms, the nuclear industry. The government are talking only about renewables as being the problem there. And they're partly right. 5 to 7 years to put up a wind farm is ridiculous. They should be able to do it in 1 to 2. But it's also true that they've got to do it for the frackers. They've got to do it for the oil and gas industries because we need those reserves. And there are rather a lot of them. Or the gas underneath our feet, the reserves are about 10 times what they are in the North Sea, at least provable reserves at the moment. So we clearly, if we'd done this 10 years ago, rather than messing around in the way the coalition did, then we could have been, at the moment, be part of the solution for Europe's problems. We could be exporting gas from this country and making a small fortune doing it, which would then have allowed the government to reduce the energy bills, potentially as one of the destinations for that cash, as well as investing in the low carbon transition through innovation, rather than being involved in these silly stunts like windfall taxes. So medium term regulatory and planning reform. I agree with John that we can't then look at the long term without thinking about fundamental reform. Bizarrely, we had the Helm review in 2016-17. And although I don't agree with everything that Dieter Helm says, it was at least a serious attempt to put together a coherent plan for the fundamental reform of UK energy systems and markets. Well, I'd like to see the government do that again, perhaps not just with one person. And I'd like them to put competition and markets at the heart of the fundamental reform. And that's got to start with a reflection on the Climate Change Act. We've got to accept we're not going to hit net zero by 2050. Making it a legally binding target is bonkers. The civil servants who sometimes get it in the neck from us are just doing their job. They're looking at that legally binding target and say, right, I'm taking this seriously. Here is what you need to do in order to achieve it. Here is the massively high carbon price that you'll need to have across the economy in order to do that. What do you mean there's a problem with the electorate about high energy prices? So unless they want to continue this crisis for many more years, they need to have some concept that this is an aspiration, not a target. We want to get to net zero. We don't want to get to it by a fixed date because we don't know if we can do that. We certainly can't do it unilaterally. So we need to cancel things like declaring a climate emergency. I mean, this is childish. I mean, this is the language of student protesters standing out in the street catastrophizing, not serious people looking to find solutions. We need clear and consistent carbon pricing across the economy. So one thing the Committee on Climate Change could usefully do is look at the domestic carbon prices, such as the implicit carbon price in fuel duty, the actual carbon price in the UK ETS, and say, here they are. Here are what the carbon prices are, from whether it's £80 per tonne of CO2 emitted, to 240 to 250 pounds of fuel duty. And it's up to Parliament then to say, okay, we are perfectly prepared to sit here and say, it's okay for white van man to subsidise people going on skiing holidays because we think there should be a lower carbon price for flying. If Parliament aren't prepared to do that, there's some hope that they might be able to level this stuff down. So at least it does look like we're taking the problem of how to price the social cost of carbon seriously. The other thing that they could be doing is looking at benchmark carbon prices internationally. It's not just the EU ETS, but what is the implicit carbon price in China, in America? Now, it's not the case that we should be looking at the international agreements and saying this is the way to solve climate change. We're looking at what people actually do. And rather than trying to lead the world by making ourselves the most expensive place in the world for energy, we should be leading the world by innovating, and we should be keeping up the carbon price at a level that is at least possibly in the ambitious group, but not far beyond that, such that we are not impoverishing ourselves and engaging in offshoring for energy-intensive industry. Finally, we should stop picking winners. If you set a carbon price, then you're going to get the best solutions to tackling climate change slowly and incrementally in a way that's not going to undermine and jeopardize energy security. Rather than a set of lobbying games that are played with the nuclear industry, that are played with the wind industry, not so much solar because there are very few solar projects that work in the UK. And also the oil and gas industry can stop being treated as though they're some kind of pariah who can be occasionally used as a cash cow. and just let them compete on a clear and level playing field that's done through market reform. So I think that's quite a lot. Oh, I did mention energy efficiency, but then neither did anybody else. So I assume we're amongst a company here that doesn't perhaps agree with Octopus Energy that heat pumps are the future. It's a nice idea, but again, it's a price issue, and we should just let people sort out energy efficiency in their own homes rather than insisting. So, conclusion: imports short term, liberalisation medium term, fundamental reform for the long term.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think you distilled many of those issues really nicely into some key principles there that we can be following for the future. And I'm glad that you sort of opened your remarks the way you did. I think often those of us who are asking questions about net zero can be sort of described as just not wanting decarbonisation and just being reactionary to that objective. But actually, I think most of our problems are with the way that net zero is being implemented. And arguably a market-friendly approach along the lines that you were describing could actually deliver faster emissions reductions than some of the ways that we've been seeing. So I think it's important to emphasize that point. You spoke about sort of how the market works with competition. It seems like there's a huge disconnect at the moment because we have new generation on the one hand, which is overwhelmingly low carbon, which the government is choosing to commission at the moment through the sort of CFD auctions, contracts for difference auctions. And then on the other hand, we see a capacity mechanism to try and balance the grid with fossil fuel forms of energy largely. So there isn't really any meaningful way that those technologies can compete against each other right now. And Dieter Helm thought that there might possibly be a way to do that through equivalent firm power auctions in which wind and solar are essentially discounted for their unreliability, and then they compete on an equivalent firm power basis. Do you think that could be an idea that might work? And if not, what other options might we have on the table?
Well, I think it's one possible option, certainly. I mean, CFDs, the question that's arisen at the moment is, do the renewable companies even believe in them themselves? Because what those that are coming on stream now are doing is ignoring their CFDs and taking the market price because it's so much better than what they could get otherwise. And I believe that they can do that for at least 3 years, according to the weak ways the contracts were set up. So we're currently paying through the nose for bad policy design, just as we have before with the renewables obligation, which frankly is an outrage that hasn't been abolished, and these companies just allowed to compete in the normal way. Now, on the government side of this, and I think it's part of Dieter Helm's argument, the idea is that the renewable companies should be guaranteed some return such that they make these longer term investments. Well, I'm intensely relaxed about that. That's the approach to go down if you want to have fixed targets for specific technologies by fixed dates. Clearly, if we need 50 gigawatts of capacity by 2030, then you've got to do that. You've got to set a price that the investors say that they will take. But that is the way to increase costs. The cost that we're paying, for example, for Hinkley Point, that was done on the same basis. And I don't usually agree with Greenpeace, but Greenpeace did describe that as the most expensive object on the planet. And we are still paying for it. We haven't cancelled it, despite pulling out at this point, potentially saving people, between looking at the impact assessment of the Nuclear Financing Act, about 68 to 120 billion pounds over the life cycle of the 35-year contract for difference. So evidently we need a different system to that. If that means that some of these things don't get built, that's fine. The alternative is gas. And we should be sticking with gas, or potentially, as John said, if coal has to come back because there's a problem in the supply of gas globally, some other alternatives as well. And if the effect of that is that we are slower in achieving our decarbonisation ambitions, that is the risk we have to take. But we clearly cannot have a situation where we're adding ever more incremental cost onto the grid with ever more intermittent systems that do not take account of their intermittency. So to that point, I agree there needs to be some way of doing that. I think there's more than one way of doing it. I don't particularly wish to break my own rule and pick a winner at this point.
Thank you, Andy. And with that, I think we'll move on to audience questions. We've had lots of questions come in, so I'm going to go and see which is going to be the most popular question to start with. So with, I think Peter Gill asked, what chance is there that the Climate Change Act will be suspended, repealed, or severely modified? You've spoken about the way in which this commitment to targets leads us to a high cost approach. How is the government going to see sense on this question and potentially change some of the way in which the legislation is set, that we have to meet these targets, and there's a sort of straitjacketed approach, if you like, that we're following at the present moment? So perhaps, John, do you want to come in first on that?
Yeah, so the question is about the Climate Change Act and I suppose related policy instruments as well. Well, this is a classic case of government waiting for the people to show some leadership. There is no impetus within government, and the civil service is locked on this issue. It will be public pressure that brings about those sorts of changes. We're not yet at that point, but I think it's quite conceivable that we will be at that point within 1 or 2 years. Things are moving quite rapidly. If the war in Ukraine it becomes more intense, prolonged, and possibly spreads, then the energy supply disruptions within Europe and the knock-on effect for us are going to become more acute. Now, I can see international economic pressure being a major factor in the cancellation of instruments such as the Climate Change Act. I mean, perhaps the most significant feature of global energy data at the moment is that energy consumption, and particularly electricity consumption, is falling in the Western economies, quite dramatically in some cases. And the UK electricity consumption has fallen by about nearly 30% since about 2006-07. We're now back at levels last seen in the 1970s. Now, that implies a reduction in standard of living, which may start to create the kind of public pressure to which I've been referring. Our total energy consumption has fallen by similar sorts of levels. In fact, we're now back at total primary input, which was last seen in the 1950s. Similar stories found throughout Europe. The US and Canada have been flatlining since about 2006-07. They're starting to decline now, partly because they're introducing more renewables. Now, I think these imply significant reductions in standard of living, increasingly fragile economic conditions, and the comparative disadvantage that the West suffers in relation to Asia, where, for example, Chinese energy consumption has risen by 50% since about the same date, 2006-07, and its electricity consumption has increased by close on 200% over that period. I mean, these are very, very significant numbers. So you have the Asian economy is on a thermodynamically sound footing, the Western economy is on a thermodynamically unsound footing, and there will be inevitably significant reductions in standard of living and economic power in the West, leading to public pressure, which will ultimately result in the cancellation of misconceived decarbonisation policies such as the Climate Change Act. Whether they will be replaced with more effective and efficient ones, perhaps along the lines that Andy's been sketching, I don't know. I think it's quite conceivable that the problems are now so acute that they'll go completely. We'll see. I'm not hostile to decarbonisation, provided that the cost does not exceed the social cost of carbon. In other words, the harm done by the emissions released. And at present, we've no idea, we've never seen a policy cost which came in under social cost of carbon. All the policies are worse than the climate change they claim to mitigate. So I think the outlook for decarbonisation policies is bleak, but not entirely hopeless.
Kathryn, if I could just bring you in on this, and in terms of the market, the energy market analysts and people that you work with, there seems to me to be an awareness of many of these issues for a long time. And yet many of the public voices of the energy industry have been very pro-renewables, pro-decarbonisation, and there hasn't seemed to be much of a debate in the energy sector about these questions. Do you think many of your colleagues are having to be quiet about these issues? And what might sort of inspire them to speak out and generate the kind of debates that we need to have to fix some of these policy problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are intimidated about expressing themselves in a forthright way and openly on these topics. It's very quick that people get shut down, either accused of being a denier or a Trump supporter. or just having their own self-interest if they happen to have fossil fuels in their portfolio. And you can believe that these challenges exist without any of those other things being true. So I think people have really shied away from it, particularly the closer people are to government, then the less likely they are to speak honestly, and the more likely they are to talk up things like renewables. The number of people, senior executives within large energy companies that still go around saying that renewables make energy cheaper, so we need more of them. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. There is no evidence for it whatsoever. And yet they still keep saying it because they say, oh, well, the wind is free. Well, yeah, okay, the wind might be free, but that doesn't mean that electricity from wind is free or nearly free or anything close. I mean, to the previous question around when we might see changes in legislation, whenever governments tie themselves up with legally binding targets, as soon as they think those targets will be missed, then the first thing they can do is just change the law, because that's within the capacity of a government, particularly a government with a large majority. And so these things have always been, to a certain extent, a little bit fake. I can't ever see a situation where a government allows itself to be in a position where it's breaking its own laws, because it can just simply change those laws. And so to a certain extent, those kinds of discussions are a little bit sort of futile, because, it's never going to come to that in the end of the day.
Thank you. Andy, a quick word on that, and then I'm keen to get to the next question, because we're running out of time, and it would be good to try and get through as many as we can.
Yeah, I just agree. It will take a crisis, and I think we can see from the way that the Northern Ireland problems are being addressed at the moment through legislation, that the government can move quite quickly when they want to. And possibly the problem has been they've moved far too quickly when they didn't need to on climate change and climate emergency bills.
So perhaps I could come back to Andy now with the next question on my list. We've had a couple on this theme, which is shale gas, and what kind of an impact that could make and how quickly it might be able to make an impact. Would you care to comment on those questions?
Sure. So the test wells that have already been put in the ground, they could be operational if there's actually reserves underneath them. And there are reasons to test wells. You have to test in exploration before you get to production. Those could be operational 6 months to a year. If the government relaxed planning regulations, you could have a mass campaign of drilling equipment going out across the country in the appropriate areas that could then see other things going into the ground for 1 to 3 years. And then you're talking about 5 to 10 years for an industry of sufficient scale to make a significant difference. But everything that you get out of the ground, whether it's small or large, is something you're not then importing. So good thing, both for the climate and for the national exchequer.
And is that likely to have an impact in a short space of time? I think one thing that people sort of get a bit confused about is actually a lot of these reasons for delays are coming from government itself. The moratorium is a government imposition. The planning system, which delays technologies, are essentially a government imposition. And so a lot of these technologies are physically possible to deliver energy in a much quicker way. And yet it's legislative barriers and government intervention that is preventing us having access to that energy source.
Well, yes. I mean, clearly, if we continue with the way we're managing this at the moment, let's just put the moratorium to one side, where we saw 3 licensing applications go through the planning process and then go through every stage of appeal because of local authority or campaign group objections, and then arrive on the desk of Michael Gove, only for him to ignore the planning inspector's advice and only approve the one that had some link to the renewable economy as feedstock for a hydrogen project. So the whole process took 3 years and the decisions were made on arbitrary political grounds. That's not a serious way to make a difference through fracking. Will it make a difference to bills next year? No, clearly not. Will the main impact on bills will come from an increase in global supply and the realignment of supply and demand. But in the longer term, given that we are going to be reliant on oil and gas for at least 20 to 30 years, if not longer, then this is something that we should be doing because we should be making money from this stuff. not paying other countries to deal with their own energy issues by buying imports when we don't need to.
In the IEA at the moment, you and your colleagues must be very frustrated on energy, but also on a whole range of issues where the government seems to be sort of tending towards a less than pro-market position. Do you think the current crisis is actually an impetus for that to start to change?
Well, it's astonishing, isn't it? I mean, Ed Miliband, despite being one of the least successful Labour leaders, has effectively won politics. This Conservative government is implementing Ed Miliband's politics and policies. If anything, they're a little bit to the left of where he was. And certainly on net zero, they're even more extreme and even more ideological in their approach. So yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. But the one good thing, I guess, about Boris's incoherence, this shopping trolley approach to policy, is that he may swerve in a different direction and potentially a more free market one if he thinks it's going to help him win the next election. Whether he'll be the leader come that election, whether there'll be somebody else, don't know. But there is every sign, I think, of anger in the backbenches of the Conservative Party that would tend to suggest that that debate is going to be had at some point, and we would hope that it would be won by the free marketeers.
Thank you. I think next, perhaps we could ask John and then Kathryn to explain in a bit more detail why do they think that sort of gas, which is seeing very high prices right now, gas-fired electricity is cheaper than, say, wind and solar, because many people who aren't perhaps that invested in the debate are just hearing claims on one hand that it's very cheap, on the other hand that it's very expensive. Can you explain in where the different costs come from and how we might reasonably be able to compare the costs between these two different technologies? John, do you want to come in on that first?
Well, you have to think about this as a system problem. We have, at the moment, a great deal of renewable energy in the UK, and indeed much in the planning system proceeding to construction. We have a lot of wind farms, a lot of solar, a great deal of solar in train, in fact, on farmland. Why then are we so exposed to the price of gas? Well, we're exposed to it because we committed so heavily to renewables. So we have a fuel diversity problem. There's trace elements of nuclear, hardly any coal now remaining. This is effectively a gas system. Security of supply is guaranteed by the sole thermodynamically competent fuel remaining, which is natural gas. Consequently, we're extremely vulnerable to it. But our demand fluctuates a great deal from year to year due to fluctuations in the renewable input, and therefore our market contracts tend to be shorter, and in any case the markets are rather demoralized, and so we're not exploring as we should be in our own resources, both in the North Sea and onshore. So we're exposed to increasing gas imports. So the renewables do nothing to guarantee security of supply. Building more will not actually address our current exposure to gas. It will actually make the problem worse and increase the costs necessary through indirect subsidies of various kinds to renewables and perhaps even new direct subsidies. So renewables got us into the current difficulties. They are certainly not going to be able to get us out. The only way you're going to be able to do that is with a thermodynamically competent fuel, such as coal, such as nuclear, or in the very short term and medium term, more natural gas. There really isn't any alternative. Don't blame me, blame the physics.
Kathryn.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I outlined this in my remarks at the beginning. Yes, you've got renewables, you've got wind and solar, and they have quite low marginal costs of generation. Unfortunately, when they sell that energy, they get a market price that's based on gas prices, because gas sets the electricity price in Britain. So renewable generation doesn't get rewarded on a cost plus basis, it gets rewarded based on a gas price basis. So it doesn't matter what the marginal running cost of wind or solar is, it still receives a gas-based price in the market. That, in my view, is quite a flaw in the system. The second reason is that it is simply not windy and sunny all the time. I've just looked up at the current generation mix right now. More than half our demand is being met with gas, and we're running coal. I mean, this is the summer. We've actually, the weather this week has been incredibly hot. We've got decent solar output, probably the best solar output that you get at any time of the year, because we're the longest days. And yet we're running coal. We were running coal yesterday as well. That is not a good sign. if we're having to rely on coal in the summer, and we rely on coal quite a lot in the winter. And there's almost no wind at the moment. It's very still. And that's why it's expensive. You build all these wind farms, you build all these solar farms, but you can't rely on them. They're not always available. And in the winter, the sun sets before the evening peak of demand. So the highest demand in the entire year, you get zero contribution from solar.
Right.
So the fact that wind and solar and renewable generators aren't receiving a price based on their own costs, but they're receiving gas prices, essentially, as you say, has frustrated a lot of people. We've seen a few commentators recently say that they want to see that system come to an end, and not have this merit order effect that we have at the moment, that the marginal generator being gas sets the price for the whole market. What would an alternative system look like? How might that work? Because it sounds right that we should be able to restrict the cost being paid to renewables to their actual cost rather than the gas price. But how might we be able to achieve that in reality?
Well, I think you could start by saying that anybody that was still in receipt of a construction subsidy has to be charged on a cost plus basis and not on the marginal gas price. And so everyone else would continue as they are, but those generators would simply just get a cost plus and then secured by whatever the subsidy framework is. And that's how I would approach it.
So you keep the existing market the same, but then you'd extract those generators like wind and solar who got CFDs or renewable obligation. You'd take them aside and then essentially have a sort of bureaucratic sort of process to decide what they get paid sort of per unit of electricity generated.
The rest of the market is primarily gas anyway. And there's not really a great deal of point in trying to play around with the rules for the small amount of coal and nuclear that's left. It's more trouble than it's worth, to be honest. And they're pretty much end-of-life assets. The priority with them should be keeping them running as long as they can. So if they get slightly higher returns than they might have done otherwise, it's probably not a bad thing because it encourages them to stay in the market and invest in maintenance. But as far as the gas fleet is concerned, I don't see a particularly compelling reason to change the mechanics of how gas gets rewarded in the market. But I do think that renewable generation, it's just winning on all counts at the moment. It's getting paid for everything. And particularly people who had the old renewables obligation, they're making huge amounts of money.
I think I'll come to a question for everyone next, which is sort of, can we look internationally at other countries who are perhaps being affected worse or being affected not as severely as we are, to try and learn some lessons from those places as to what might be the better approaches or worse approaches? John, do you want to come to that first?
It's a bitter pill, but Chinese energy policy is well designed. They know exactly what they're doing. They're generating as much societal sophistication as they possibly can from fossil fuels, and they're banking that as advanced nuclear technology. And that is what we should be doing. And they're quite happy to allow us, of course, to fool ourselves with the renewables projects at present. But we have to eat humble pie and realize that the engineer bureaucrats of Beijing have got this right, and that the lawyers in Westminster and the White House are mistaken.
Andy, do you want to come in on that as well?
Well, I think there's something in what John said there. I guess the cheap answer is not Germany. But, I mean, clearly, we could look at America and what they did with fracking as an example that we should have followed 10 years ago. We would still follow today in order to provide some short-term relief. But in terms of the general energy system approach, no. I mean, it's not a great picture around the world. And I think, at the moment, for example, the nuclear lobby looking at France and saying, why can't we achieve that great French miracle, perhaps should be looking a little bit harder at what the French nuclear industry is actually delivering, which is not very impressive and is deeply worrying in respect of future costs.
Kathryn?
So I would slightly disagree with that and say that I think France has actually had quite a good approach. The French system started to go wrong maybe a decade ago when they stopped investing in nuclear. And they suffered a large sort of skills gap since then, a loss of skill from the workforce. And that's creating significant problems for them now. But if you look at how France has benefited from its nuclear fleet in the last sort of 50 years, that's been very significant. And France has been exporting very consistently. It's only now that it's running into trouble. And that's as a result of a relatively recent change in policy and lack of investment. So if they'd stuck with how they were up until about 10 years ago, then actually that would have been quite a good approach to take. I don't really think there's anywhere else in the developed world that's worth looking at. Australia's just, had to suspend its market altogether because of their, again, poor policy choices. Germany, complete basket case. The countries that seem to be doing okay are the ones that actually have a sort of a beneficial resource like geothermal or hydro that they can rely on. But if you don't happen to have that, then most of the developed countries have been in quite significant trouble with this.
And on nuclear, is there a sort of upper threshold in terms of what share you can have of nuclear in the system? It can't be ramped up and down as easily as gas can in terms of sort of meeting those day-to-day fluctuations in energy demand. Where do you think the French are approaching that point in the sense that it becomes less efficient to run a system if you're having to turn off nuclear power stations at times that it would not be beneficial for that plant, at least in its economics, to do so?
Well, France has got 15% of its installed base is pumped hydro, so they're not just solely relying on nuclear. But I would say that, I see nuclear as a sort of security of supply issue. And in the same way that the government is responsible for physical security, such as the army and the police, I think it should also have a responsibility for basic energy security. So I'd actually like to see the government directly investing in nuclear power, put it on the government balance sheet, fund it through government borrowing, and deliver a baseload capacity that the least matches, say, your summer nighttime demand, which is where that's your minimum system demand through the year. And you can do that without any need for ramping up and down, because you're just meeting the sort of the amount that you don't flex below, if you like. And so that's where I'd like to see nuclear contributing. There are developments within nuclear that can allow nuclear to be more flexible. And those are things that are worth exploring, but you can certainly have a baseload component that's provided in that way.
Perhaps I could just chip in here on we should start thinking more about nuclear for high temperature process heat in addition to electricity. And one of the most critical areas in which the British economy is exposed to natural gas prices is industrial process heat. There is no renewable offering for high temperature heat at reasonable cost. And there are limits to the high temperatures that you can generate with electricity practically in any industrial situation. Nuclear, small modular reactors going up to 700, 900 degrees centigrade, very, very hot indeed, ideal for industrial process heat, are actually running and have been running in Japan since 1998. They haven't yet been deployed very widely. We know that China is working on this as well. It's an extremely interesting area, and it avoids a lot of the integration problems that people have pointed out with regard to ramping large-scale nuclear. So nuclear for high-temperature heat, I think it should be a renewed focus, or a new focus, actually, for us.
Well, we've just got time for maybe one or two more questions. So perhaps the first one of those could be an easy win that hopefully all our panelists will agree with, or maybe they won't, which would be look at green taxes, the environmental levies that currently are imposed on energy bills, and actually businesses face an even greater cost for these environmental levies because they're not protected from some of those policies in the same way that domestic consumers are. And we've seen a lot of organizations, even from the renewable lobby, say that actually those should go from energy bills to general taxation and fund them that way. Do all our panelists agree that that would be something that you could do very quickly to start bringing bills down in the short term? Andy, do you want to come in on that?
Yes.
That's nice and straightforward. Anything more to comment on that? Why isn't that happening yet?
Well, it's not happening because the government is far too close to the renewable industry. It's got into this, again, Miliband style narrative of predator capitalism, which are all the nasty oil and gas companies and heroes and of the renewable industry. And it wants to be taking selfies with those guys and being nice to them and listening to them when they say, if you do anything to hurt this, then our investment will go somewhere else, while at the same time doing the opposite with the predators. So it is just politics.
But in a way, they would still
not brave.
They would still get the money if it was funded by the government instead. So what would they have to be concerned about?
Well, it's a lovely sweetheart deal, the renewables obligation. Now, if you are Scottish Power, before the crisis, you were making about a 50% margin from your portfolio of renewable investments. That I would imagine is looking more like 150 to 200% at the moment. So why would you want to rock that boat? Why wouldn't you instead suggest the government should be increasing bills in a different way and then making everybody else pay for your very high margins and getting away with it?
Kathryn, any comments to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think another reason the government's resisted is because it still believes in this polluter pays narrative, despite the fact that people on the lowest incomes have very little control over their consumption and are making binary choices between heating and eating. The current way of recovering these levies is extremely regressive, and there are very few people within the industry that actually believe that they should continue along that road. The downside is that even if you did take those levies out, they only impact electricity bills. There's a small new levy on gas that's been introduced in the last since the end of last year. Given where prices are at the moment, it won't actually make a huge amount of difference. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. I also think we should have VAT relief on domestic energy bills.
Right.
And do you think there's a legal way that you can sort of get the cost of perhaps renewable obligation certificates down in particular? Because people look at the contracts for difference and think that it's actually quite difficult now that these are binding contracts that have been signed to actually limit people's exposure to that. Are there any avenues that you could see how that might happen?
The government can pass laws. It can legislate to do this at any time. Obviously, that is something that should be done with caution because it impacts investor confidence. The renewables obligation is so egregious, though, that I think this is one area where an exception should be made, and the government should signal to the market that people with renewables obligations that don't have long-term fixed price PPAs have been benefiting from windfall returns for a long time, and that's not going to continue. And then they should either impose a windfall tax or they should just restructure the RO.
It was actually part of the original design of the renewables obligation that the certificates price should fall to zero when the targets were met in order to protect the consumer against excess cost. So the principle is actually embedded in the legislation. There's no reason why government shouldn't engineer a fall in the renewables obligation certificate price in order to protect consumers at the present time. And I think it's extremely pusillanimous of government not to have done this in view of the excess profits currently accruing.
So perhaps just finally, because we're very short of time, I'd like to ask the panelists about small modular nuclear reactors. This is certainly something that's caught my interest for a long time. I desperately want it to be a success. And it seems like it could be sort of 5 to 8 years away that some of these projects might be coming into fruition. And if they are successful, they look like they could be built much more quickly, replicated many times over, and actually start to meet some of these challenges, albeit not straight away. They could avoid some of those problems that we've been seeing with huge nuclear power stations that get bogged down by delays and cost overruns. Have you been looking at this, and what's your perspective on the potential that these might offer? Kathryn, do you want to start?
Right, so I mean, just briefly on large nuclear, the problem has been technology choice. You know, the government jumped onto the European pressurized water reactor on the basis that nobody was offering anything else at the time. It was a really poor choice. Even at the time those decisions were made, it was very clear that EDF was struggling to deliver those projects. A better option would have been to go for the advanced boiling water reactor that was proposed for Anglesey. And those types of reactors were built in Japan in 4 years, on time and on budget before Fukushima. That's a 4-year construction time. So I think that is the route that we should be going. And frankly, the government, and if it was my money, I would just be doing it. No even discussion. Talk to the, there are about 3 companies that offer these types of reactors and just get those deals done. When it comes to small reactors, I haven't seen anybody that thinks they can get one in the market sooner than 8 or 9 years. I don't honestly really understand why. You look at somebody like Rolls-Royce, they've been supplying nuclear reactors for marine propulsion for years, decades. So quite why they need so much time to commercialize a land-based offering, I don't know. I think the technology could be very interesting, but the proof has yet to be delivered, really.
Indeed, lots of questions being raised there in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. Andy.
Well, I'd like this to succeed. I mean, I'd like there to be some part of the nuclear industry that can actually deliver nuclear power to the cost schedule that they've said and to the time period that they've also stated. If Rolls-Royce is telling the truth, unlike, say, EDF were, going back to the original foundations of the EPR system, then this is great. We shouldn't have to do anything. They should just be getting on with it and being able to put this stuff into the market and taking the risk themselves via their shareholders or via long-term investors who want to take those risks. What I don't want is to be in the position where it's a cozy stitch-up between government and a corporation to deliver a specific technology that then turns out many years down the line to be an expensive waste of money and a mess like the original British nuclear industry was. We're still paying £3 billion a year for what was a totally misguided industrial policy. And to go back to Kathryn's earlier point on the French, well, it's the dartboard theory, isn't it? They threw one dart and it hit the board and it was okay. They've thrown another, the EPR system, and it's a totally useless piece of rusting technology that we are going to severely regret having invested in, and we're still going further with it with Sizewell-C. So let's hope Rolls-Royce are not EDF, and they are the ones who can actually make nuclear work.
Kathryn, do you just want to come back on any of that?
Well, I mean, the problems with EDF are widespread. I don't know that they were deliberately trying to mislead anybody. I would say there were 3 main issues that they faced. One is the de-skilling of the workforce due to a pause in new build projects. The second was around the tightening of regulation following Fukushima. And I think some of those regulations are just frankly inappropriate in the European context. You shouldn't need to have to withstand the strength of earthquakes that you get in Japan and California, for example, in Britain or France, because we simply don't see anything of that nature by orders, factors of thousands. So that's very inappropriate. And actually, the third one's just escaping me at the moment. But yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult technology, partly because of its own internal problems and partly because of external problems. And really, we should just be following a different road.
Thank you. And John, perhaps you want to have the final word of our webinar.
On the question of small modular reactors, I'm not hostile to the Rolls-Royce proposal. Perhaps it has merit. I don't think it's particularly small. It's 450 megawatts or thereabouts, and it's dubiously modular. And I think it'd be a pity if that were to distract attention from things which are genuinely small and could actually be deployed rather more rapidly and for non-electrical purposes. As I say, the government of Japan has had a genuinely small sub 50 megawatt thermal reactor in operation since 1998, and it is ready for commercialization. That's a high temperature heat reactor. It's a high temperature gas cooled reactor, in fact. It's an extremely interesting design with walkaway safety, relatively cheap, and could be deployed quite quickly. I think we have to be more open-minded about what we're expecting from nuclear, not just electricity, and they really could be quite tiny and deployed in industrial situations.
Thank you, John. Well, finally, just from me to say a big thank you to our panelists. We've delved into some really important issues there, and I think they've left us with a lot to be thinking about, and hopefully this message is starting to get through to government that these challenges are now so urgent and people are paying such high prices for energy that there is really a strong impetus now to start developing some solutions to the problems that we've been facing. John has a exciting new paper coming up on European energy policy that we're very excited about launching. So please look out for information about that from our newsletter shortly. And we're looking forward to having an in-person event to celebrate that launch of that new paper. So do look out for that. And just thank you for joining, everyone. We've had people from around the world, and so we're very grateful for people who have made time in their day at whatever time of day it is where they live to join us for this discussion. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time.